Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Chris Andrew podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Today, if you haven't read the headline, I'm delighted to tell you that we're going to be talking about Australia is still a colony. Welcome to the Chris Andrew podcast. Thanks so much for joining for another episode and for listening. I love having you here. Today shapes up to be another fun one. We're going to be discussing the idea that Australia is still very much a colony. Obviously, we started as a colony, the concept of a unified Australia. Obviously, the concept of the nation of Australia started off the back of the federation of various British colonies here. And in the century plus since, I guess there's been a sense that it's a place with a unique cultural identity and autonomy. And to an extent, obviously, those are both true, but I think we maybe underestimate the extent to which Australia is still very much not only in a cultural colonial mindset, but quite literally through many mechanics a colony. And it's sort of shifted in the dynamics of what those forces are that make that true. And we're going to look at them today because it's, I think, a recurrent theme that keeps coming up when looking at the problems that the country faces and why we aren't able to implement certain solutions or why we aren't able to talk about them in particular ways. I find it's a bit of an invisible, under-discussed pitfall that we keep running into. And so I'm hoping to use the space today to open up a discussion on some of those ideas and see where they land. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. If you do just generally have thoughts about any of the podcasts, please do get in touch on the Instagram. It's at Chris Andrew Podcast. And I should say that I'm doing today's episode thanks to the voting of my Patreon patrons. Feel free to go on and check it out at patreon.com/Endry, E-N-D-R-E-Y. You can also vote for what the future episodes might be on. Plus, I do extra content now and then, and also music stuff, coaching stuff. The works, really. It's the wonderland that you didn't know existed. That's maybe everything you've ever been looking for. And that's my minimum promise to you. So thanks so much if you're already part of that. Thanks to the patrons. Let's get straight into it. All right. So Australia is still a colony. That's a pretty bold claim to make. There are, of course, I guess most obviously. So Australia is still a colony. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I guess I've got to start talking about what the opposite of that would be, because I think that we broadly treat Australia as a sovereign nation and an independent entity in how we think about it and conceive of ourselves as citizens within that network. And we treat it that way in the sense that we assume that we have a degree of control over the decisions that are made within the territory of Australia, within the democratic systems that ostensibly represent us, and that at least at some level, many of the decisions and interests being made and represented are done with consideration to the well-being and interests of the citizens, the people that live there. And I think across today's explorations, you might find that the degree to which that is true is perhaps a lot less than we normally discuss it as. And the external forces that are trading within those realms of what happens in Australia and what happens to its people that have nothing to do with the interests of the people that live there are far larger and far more significant than I think most of us would estimate. And I hope that by baking that into how we talk about the problems that we collectively face, we can have a more realistic and hopefully useful mapping of how we may need to go about solving some of the problems that we face. So I guess I should start by proclaiming the obvious and very literal sense in which we're still a colony, which is that, of course, we are not an independent nation in that we are a constitutional monarchy with the British Crown as our head of state. That obviously doesn't mean what it would have meant 5 centuries ago, in that we're not directly under the rule of the whims of King Charles. He's not issuing diktats, etc. But it is still, I think, a not insignificant presence. Obviously, the capacity to have veto over any law that's passed in the Australian Parliament and to dismiss a government is a huge power. And whilst it has only been exercised once, it has been exercised. And so that comes, I guess, with 2 gravities. One is, well, it materially can occur, but the other one is it sort of sits as an unconscious reminder of where authority comes from, largely somewhere else, the United Kingdom. And I guess sits as a little disincentive to rock the boat too much against that. Now, that doesn't really come up much as a cultural issue because, the UK is remote and has its own problems. But as the UK is declining in global relevance, certainly relative to Australia and other powers in the world, it It's kind of weird that it still exists, I think. As you know, we had a referendum in 1999 on whether or not to become a republic and to turf them, but we didn't pass that. But I don't think that's a good representation of how most Australians feel about the existence of the monarchy. I'm not suggesting that a majority would reject it, but I think it would be pretty close. The relevance of King Charles to the day-to-day life of Australians is not even as strong as just a compelling cultural quirk. It probably feels like a weird hangover to most Australians, and that's because the country is totally different to what it was even 20 years ago. From ABS data, only 33% of Australians can trace an ancestry of any kind back to England. That's a small minority to keep the keys to the country in another hemisphere. And I think that the symbolic connections that we have, obviously the Union Jack is on the Australian flag, we've got monarchs on the currency, they're all just cultural quirks that I don't think people would actively choose given the chance. That's just my sense of things. And obviously there are those who would, hardcore fans of the monarchy, but I think you can even be a fan of the monarchy and not really see its day-to-day connection to Australian society. It does say something interesting about where we've come from, but I think that those reminders that we as Australians are not masters of our own destiny in some sense only go to further entrench some of the points that I'm going to go on to make. And I guess the first one is that if you've ever started an organization or worked somewhere where things are not going well, or if you just like to watch cultures generally, you probably have a sense of how powerful a force culture is for dictating and then maintaining the habits and behaviors of members of a group. And it's my observation, and I'm certainly not the only one who's made it, but there's a kind of cultural hangover to coming from colonial origins that engenders a low confidence attitude to the capacity for Australia to do its own things and make its own decisions and produce its own value. And so for me, that's something that I think I continuously see in our cultural discourse where, compared to other countries, we're surprisingly unambitious in realms in which we really deserve to have confidence and ambition. This wasn't always the case. You know, we were early on leaders. With South Australia, I think, were first to have universal suffrage, and the other colonies were quite early in adopting that. But outside of that, it's quite surprising to me how heavily we rely on external signifiers to determine what value is. And that's not just in political reforms or things like that, but even just the very cultural conversation that we have. I'll get into this a little bit later as it touches onto some of the other points I'm going to make. But yes, I think firstly, it's really worth noting that even though we're not directly ruled by the hand of the king, I still think that there's a strong cultural hangover where, as a colony, we just assume that things that come from centers of authority are good. And those centers of authority are not Canberra. I mean, who in their right mind thinks that an Australian is going to listen to somebody say, well, this is a new idea from Canberra, it's good. Whereas, you know, if you hear, well, this is a new thing that's coming out of London or New York, you're more likely to hear it out. Which is absurd, because whilst that may be good for problems that we share, Australia does have its own very distinct problems that we can't solve through the lens of other cultures, and we can't wait for other people to innovate to solve for us. And so that tendency comes with a big cost, in my opinion. And maybe the most obvious one of those problems, which is one from the foundation of the concept of Australia, is the Indigenous dispossession and subsequent cultural loss and disadvantage, and now I guess the sort of cultural backswing where you have a large swathe of society trying to correct that, but without sort of mechanical means to do so. So you get a whole bunch of culture war stuff instead, which is, you know, it's not doing the job that potentially can't be done anyway. But it makes for, I would say, a pretty staggering rift at the heart of the concept of Australia, and certainly hammers home again that it is a colony because, you know, what's our capacity to solve our own problems in what is perhaps our greatest problem, seemingly pretty poor. The recent referendum was an example of that. Regardless of which position you took on it, I think you could see why the whole discourse and the whole process was a disaster in all directions. So that's just one of many topics that you could look at and choose, and I'll look at some subsequent ones throughout the episode. But the continuation of the Australia project as something that is from Britain, and I guess the cultural baggage that we carry from that, ongoingly robs us of the capacity to have an autonomous, self-guided design and approach to fixing the problems that we face, and also taking advantage of the opportunities that we have. So moving from the obvious ways in which we're a colony, I guess another one is our relationship with the United States. We're a junior partner in that alliance. They've obviously been the unipolar superpower in the world from the end of the Cold War until, I guess, now. So a quick history tour, you're probably across it, but it's worth another journey. In World War II, when the British outpost of Singapore fell to the Japanese, that was a really shocking cultural moment for Australians, because basically up until that point, Australians would still call themselves British, and it became clear that we were no longer really under the umbrella of a great power that could protect us. And so then there's a pivotal point where after that, we leaned increasingly on the US, and to today are very integrated with the US. We're still very integrated with the UK as well. But the US is really who we look to guarantee our security in a world in which Australia is never going to have the population or economic might to be a large superpower or anything. We find ourselves obviously geographically in a world that is culturally different to the center of Australian society, which sees really funny dualities of us. You know, China's our number one trade partner, but then at the same time, we're sailing freedom of navigation exercises through the South China Sea with our Navy, joint stuff with the US as well, and investing heavily in submarines, whatever. Don't need to go into the specifics of that, but it is very clear that we make those decisions not for ourselves, but on behalf of decisions that are made within the Pentagon on our behalf. And that belies a degree of autonomy and sovereignty in that we hand over the capacity to make those huge expenditure decisions and strategic decisions, not to Canberra, but we outsource them to Washington. And that is most obviously manifest in the US military bases and defense architecture that is physically in Australia. There are places to which we don't have autonomy or control over that the US do on the Australian continent, most notably the Pine Gap facility outside of Alice Springs, which is, as far as I understand, a signals intelligence and operations center. But, we don't really get to know because we don't have autonomy over our own continent in that sense. There's a great article on Pine Gap by Felicity Ruby in the Australian Foreign Affairs Journal. It's called Silent Partners, US Bases in Australia. And in that, she talks about how Malcolm Fraser went from being instrumental as a prime minister in preventing the public from accessing information about Pine Gap, but then how he has pivoted in his stance on that through his life. And now he believes that Pine Gap, through its expanded role, exposes Australia to and now he believes that Pine Gap actually exposes. So he defended this protection of it through a book that he published, Dangerous Allies, in 2014. But believes that the relationship with the US actually became dangerous at the end of the Cold War. And he believes that Pine Gap now, today, exposes Australians to prosecution for war crimes or crimes against humanity because it's used in the conduct of extrajudicial drone strikes on countries with which Australia is not at war. And also not just those countries, often those drone strikes are hitting a lot of civilian targets as collateral or by design. And this is a quote from Malcolm Fraser, former Prime Minister. In the beginning, Pine Gap was defensive in character. The new uses to which the information it gathers can be put transforms Pine Gap into a critical part of an offensive weapons system. Australia should not be a part of it. We cannot deny the facility's existence. Neither could we dictate to the Americans that the information it gathers must not be used for the targeting of their weapons. We can hardly say to our neighbours that we are not complicit in American drone killings when the real-time information our facility collects is used for that purpose. And I think maybe the main point for this episode is that we don't have control over the information or its usage. We don't have information of the conduct of those facilities because they are American. And whilst we have staff working there for sure, it's an American project. And so if America decides to do something that is starkly against Australia's interests, which there's plenty of examples of that you could go to, then there's nothing we can really do about it. There's no citizen mechanism for controlling that, and we're kind of just along for the ride, which is, I think, is just great evidence for being a colony rather than an autonomous actor in the world. And further to exactly that point, something that's always struck me is that Australia strategically is obviously an island continent nation with a low population, lots of money, and kind of an impossible place to invade in that the distances are so huge, the terrain so rough, etc., etc., etc. We did get a scare in World War II with the bombing from Japan and the submarine in Sydney Harbour. Those are pretty small things compared to the other conflicts that occurred in that time, which is to say that we're kind of really well positioned to just be a peaceful place, to only be a force for peace in the world, to be neutral, to be non-aligned, to put a bit of money into having just defensive structures or being prepared, but certainly not to be fighting the types of wars that other parts of the world seem doomed to. I think we kind of get a lucky leave pass from that and could be a really positive force. Consequently, maybe it will be surprising to you how many wars we have been a part of because it seems to me that we never really found a war that we didn't like or didn't want to get involved in. Initially, you could see why they're just wars of empire and, Britain putting up the Union Jack and calling us along, etc. But by 2025, it's kind of absurd that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, sending tanks to Eastern Europe. All the horrible news this week that the Australian soldier, former SAS soldier, got charged with a war crime. Finally, somebody got charged for something. I mean, he executed a civilian in Afghanistan. There were some circumstances that made it an issue of judgment, but just meta to the specifics of that situation. Why are any Australians fighting in Afghanistan? What did the Afghans ever do to us? I don't even know what the diplomatic relations between Australia and Afghanistan would be beyond the fact that we now, thanks to the war, have a lot of Afghans living in Australia, hopefully having a more peaceful time than we gave them through our participation in the overthrow of that state. Anyway, not the topic of this video. Let's go through some of these conflicts. I'll go through all of them because I think the sheer weight of them should be surprising. Okay. Second Boer War, which ended in 1902. Boxer Rebellion. We sent troops to quell the Boxer Rebellion in China. World War One. Again, even though it's a definitive part of Australia's cultural identity in a lot of ways, I don't know how many of us really have the sense of why it was so important for Australia to end the Ottoman Empire. There are Australians fighting in the Russian Civil War. That makes sense. Armenian-Azerbaijani War, 1918 to 20. Egyptian Revolution of 1919. 27 Malaita Punitive Expedition. I never even heard of that. It was in the Solomon Islands. There you go. World War II, Anglo-Iraqi War in 1941, Korean War, another disaster, Malayan Emergency, Borneo Confrontation, Vietnam War, Gulf War, intervention to the East Timorese crises, Civil War in Afghanistan, regular war in Afghanistan, Iraq War Part 2, Operation Anode in the Solomons, Iraqi Civil War, Operation Astute, part of the East Timorese crisis, Operation Ocean Shield, Iraqi Civil War, whatever. American-led intervention in the Syrian Civil War. What has Australia got to do with that? I didn't even know about that one. Did you know Australians were fighting in Syria? I hope nobody died. I don't think they did. Sorry. I don't think any Australians died. Lots of people died and are dying still in Syria. Whatever. I mean, these are all these conflicts. I didn't even get to the rest of them. Most recently, Iran, Saudi Arabia proxy conflicts. We've been involved in that. What's Australia done? I don't know. But obviously, we're in all these wars because we're part of the global architecture of the US military sort of hegemony across most of the globe. And that's a decision that we've made. But it does really illustrate that we're not autonomous over what is a very important part of a state's function, which is going and sending people to kill and die for particular causes. And in these instances, there aren't really democratic mechanisms by which we're even choosing these causes. It's something I talk about a little bit in the democracy episode, which you may want to go back to, because I'll talk a bit more about those types of themes, but I think I go into it at a better degree. But the issues of who we kill and die for, they don't require an act of parliament and they don't require a majority of the ruling party to support them. Just by executive alone, Australia can make the decision to go to war in these very far-flung places that have nothing to do with the direct interests of everyday Australians, other than, I guess, the loose tie to hope that Australia remains under the US protectorate of its nuclear umbrella and all the other systems that we have. It's an ongoing debate in security circles whether that's worth doing, because it also comes with risks, because places like Pine Gap become nuclear targets in the event of a war between America and another rival superpower. I just think on balance, these are not topics that are in the cultural discourse much outside of strategic circles, which is proof itself that we are still a colony and that it's not the concern of the day-to-day operations of the people that live there, even though whether or not you're a nuclear target does seem to me like something that should be very, very important, even more important than, capital gains tax or other things that are important. So that goes to the next point, which is Australia is not really a democracy. Democracy kind of doesn't really exist anywhere particularly well, but I think that we don't have the sense that we're not a democracy. I think most people would think that Australia is a very good and functioning democracy because we do have very, very good elements, such as the AEC is excellent. Universal participation is, it's not for everybody, but it certainly gets an outcome and is better than, say, 30% participation or something like that. And, we don't have violence around our election results and we don't have corruption that plagues other places. And so that seems like a win. But the loss is kind of at another level, which makes it maybe more insidious, that we're not even voting on many of the issues that are the most important to us. And as I said, I talk about that in the democracy episode, so I don't really want to get sucked into it too much here. but just to say that there are big swathes of the things that are important to Australian society that are broadly untouched by its democratic processes. And I think that that's most evident in many of the biggest problems that we face, why institutions such as government seem sort of so completely feckless to deal with them. And that's fine when everything's rolling along nicely, but when things are difficult or not going well, that can become a big problem very quickly. And I think you see that in certain realms of Australian society, where certain things that are really key to our interests, there's no movement on at all. And yeah, I'll go into what some of those are. So firstly, I want to say there's a lot of untaken opportunities that I could talk about here, but those can become a bit abstract quickly. So I don't want to get sucked into the context of those. But I think that there are certain things that you would see in other countries that you don't see in Australia because they're not on the agenda that people generally are supportive of, regardless of what you individually think about these things. Things like massive scale solar projects or even massive scale nuclear projects, very fast rail, these types of projects of ambition, they sort of float onto the agenda and there are scoping studies done, but it's sadly obvious to all parties that these things are just little more than pipe dreams in instance after instance. And this is for multiple complex reasons, but even if you were to go another level of abstraction to think of all the things that you could do with the tremendous wealth that we have in Australia and wealth of talent as well, and don't even seem to be beginning to get off the ground. That's a confluence of, I think, this cultural inheritance where we think that good things come from somewhere else and are not that ambitious, but also a kind of stagnant weight of incumbent forces. And I'll go on to talk about the private ones shortly. But it's clear that there are also foreign government actors that have, at very least, an indifference to the progression of Australian civil experience and, at worst, an incentive to underinvest in it because of the investments that those nations represent. So to go into some of the most egregious and obvious ones are in resource collection and resource taxes. I think it's so egregious now that it's well past the point of whether it's an ideological position on, how much do you want to tax something versus how much you want to let people do their own thing to incentivize growth and whatever. It's very clear that under the terms of our constitution, the resources under the Australian people are owned by the Australian people. And yet we get a diminishing pittance from the extraction industries who are at the same time having just exponential growth in the astronomical profits that they take. And there's graph after graph that shows this. I'll post some on Instagram through the week. But it's so insulting now for things like gas, which has gone massively up and Australians are still paying a large amount for. And unfortunately, in this case, you do have one-to-one examples where you can see places, very diverse societies like Qatar or Norway, who are sort of peers in the amount of money that they are sitting on in terms of their natural resources, and the amount of money that they are able to take in for their societies versus Australia is embarrassing. And the main way in which it would be defensible for these companies that control these resources to be so profitable would be, well, that money still goes into Australian society. But that's kind of not really the case at all. With mining and extraction being one of the least owned Australian industries of all the sectors of our society, whilst bringing in so much wealth. It's hard to get the exact figures, but it looks like it's around the realm of 90% foreign owned for mining. So you can only feel foolish because Australians obviously want to change this at the citizen level, but there's kind of no grounds to recourse with both major parties in lockstep because they've got this revolving door between the people who are in those parties. Once they're voted out of office, they former energy ministers of Australia, pop, they appear as directors on the board of Santos or whatever. It's like, if you heard about it coming from a Yugoslavian country, it'd be like, oh, that's about right. These tin pot places, everything's so corrupt. But for some reason, we just accept it in Australia and don't seem to have the recourse to do anything about it. And I think that is a great example of a type of colonization, which is the increasing ceding of key areas of our sovereign society and the things that we need to collectively have some mechanism of making decisions over to ensure good quality lives and optimal civic development into the corporate sphere. As I've said in past episodes, one interesting feature of aristocracies in the past was that the local baron or whatever, at least ostensibly, had some soft responsibility for making sure that you were taken care of within their jurisdiction. And one funny thing about today's globalized society is that if your resources are controlled by an algorithm that's maintained as a filing cabinet in Panama, then there's no direct line of responsibility. And increasingly, Australia has consciously at some points and unconsciously at others handed off huge swathes of its wealth and society to the sorts of grayscale, totally unaccountable, or not even unaccountable, just more totally disinterested. There's no incentive overlap for them to care about what's happening within Australia itself. And that is another kind of sort of corporate colonization. So a lot of the things that I've said here are obviously applicable to all sorts of different societies. It's not just Australia. It's as the world's become more globalized, it's the case that the transfer of many domains into corporate power has meant the transfer of kinds of sovereignty of particularly important realms to multinationals that are not incentivized to have an interest in the day-to-day experience of the people of the markets in which they operate. But it's still worth looking at in an Australian context, because I think it might surprise you the extent to which even Australian capital activity is not incentivized to be connected to Australia in any way. So it's kind of hard to get good data, which is already pretty damning. In fact, I might even start with that as a point. There was where are we looking? There's a report done into foreign investment in Australia by David Richardson and Rod Campbell of the Australia Institute, which was first published in June 2022 and revised and reissued in August 2023. And their subtitle is Australian Big Business is Not Very Australian at All. And considering the importance of things like energy, resources, even food, agricultural manufacturing, whatever, this is an alarming and damning part of their conclusion. Okay. There is practically no data available to the public on the level of Australian beneficial ownership of major corporations in key sectors of the economy, such as banking, mining, and energy. Where data is available, its workings are unclear. Privately compiled data by Bloomberg offers some insights, but with limited sample sizes. So they've gone and looked at what the foreign ownership is of various businesses. They looked at the time of the top 10 ASX listed companies, and it's astonishing. I think that the data that I'm about to give you should cut across all political lines, because regardless of your ideological bend and whether you tend towards free market or state ownership or whatever you think the tax levels should be, et cetera, I think you might have a different perception of things if you knew that. This is a market capitalization of companies in Australia. It's from 2003. Top is BHP Group Limited. They have a market capitalization of $250 billion. And the foreign ownership from the Bloomberg sample they're able to determine is 94.4%. 94.4%. Rio Tinto, number 2, their market cap's a bit lower, 180 billion, 95%. Commonwealth Bank of Australia. I think people would generally assume that Commonwealth Bank and all of its activities would be Australian. But what these guys did was they looked at where companies were just sort of shell holdings in Australia to have an Australian sort of presence, but are not in any way connected to ownership or the interests of Australia. 80% foreign ownership. CSL Limited, another huge one, I just assume was completely Australian, 86% foreign owned. National Australia Bank, 82%. Block Inc., they're 27% foreign owned. How about that? Way to go, Block Inc. Well, I've never heard of Block Inc. What the hell's Block Inc. do? Block Inc. Oh, wow. No, it's American though. Oh God, Block Inc. is Afterpay. It's actually an American company, but it acquired Afterpay. So maybe they're mostly doing Afterpay stuff in Australia, which is why it's mostly Australian owned. I don't know. Westpac Bank is 84% foreign ownership. ANZ 75, Mac Bank 69, Fortescue Metals 89%. So this is a rate of Australian shares tracked by Bloomberg as largely owned by overseas entities. And I think that if you had that conception of what these businesses are and what their incentives are for the interest of Australian society, like should we be building a sovereign wealth fund? Should we be doing X development to improve other areas of business competitiveness or diversity of the economy, or investing in the education of people, or whatever it might be? You would be having a very different conversation if they were if the top company in Australia was called British and American Mining, and then the second company was called American and German Banking. I think we would have a very different cultural conception of these things, but we don't, because of the anonymization of these things and the intentional, I'd say, obfuscation of ownership. And the fact, as I said at the start, that there's not good data on these key industries is already damning enough. But another realm of corporate colonization where it gets even more insidious is the actual relationship of fronts of foreign businesses in the machinations of government. And if you've worked in the federal government, as I have, I'm sure the same is true across state and local level. it's kind of shocking how much stuff is outsourced generally, but outsourced to the same few consulting firms. There's the big four, then there's also Boston and McKinsey and whatever, a few others. But it's an increasing phenomena that if you're not in government, you may not have encountered, but if you are, you'll definitely be aware of. There's kind of an erosion of capacity where things aren't really done in-house, and there's an incentive to get super experts in as consultants to make decisions and build structures around things. And that becomes a sort of self-eating snake where the more you do it, the less you build up the internal capacity. The more you outsource general business activities or concept formation or policy decision or whatever it might be, each time you do it, you erode the capacity to do those things in-house, and you increase the capacity of those things to be done out-house. And you build incentives over time for anyone who's within an organization who knows anything and is good at getting stuff done, to go and leave and to work for these organizations that pay a lot better. And it kind of tilts the scale to a terminal point. And I really saw this at climate change, where something like 20-something% of our business was done by consultants. And those consultants are not subject to the same rigorous processes of public accountability as the public servants. And often that's kind of why they're engaged, because the public service is a very, in a lot of ways, passive system, because the incentive is to stay small and to not get grilled and not to do the wrong thing. So that makes it hard to make big risks, because big decisions come with bigger risks of failure. And by outsourcing it and say, oh, well, this is the advice that we got from Boston Consulting Group, then it kind of looks reasonable. But the problem with doing that all the time is that you are, and in Australia we are, increasingly handing over your government to a bunch of for-profit companies that are all American-owned. It doesn't matter that they're American-owned. They could be anywhere. Even if they were Australian-owned, it would be not good, given that the whole point of having things done by the state is typically because they have a line of representation or accountability back to the citizens and an interest to act on behalf of citizens. Now, it's not so insidious as saying that these organizations are coming in and being like, well, let's make as much money as possible. In many instances, they are. But even the fact that it's not obvious that the state has its own capacity to enact its own policies or even to generate them is pretty frightening. And I think that if these companies were state actors, then it would be very obviously a bridge too far and too much of our national sovereignty and autonomy to hand over to another actor. But because they're sort of disparate companies and because they're competing in the public realm, it doesn't look so bad, even though it is the same handful of companies that end up getting huge chunks of government work and doing work on huge swathes of government work on significant programs. It kind of removes the teeth of the state to function in its stated way in the interest of Australian people. And exactly as I said, if instead of KPMG and PwC and Ernst & Young or whatever, you heard that it was the American State Department, it was the British Foreign Office, and it was the Chinese military, you would think maybe we should be doing these things for ourselves. But these companies represent interests that are just as large and as powerful as those in other ways. But also, as I said, not only are they not subjected to the same sort of checks and balances, they're also just by design not accountable to the same thing that the public service is. So I get it. Sometimes you don't have the expertise to do things in-house, but then where you don't, you should either develop that capability or not have it as an area of government at all. Certainly not pretend that it's a good idea for PwC to be recommending all their tax policies or whatever the revolving door of financial incentives might be there. I think this is an interesting topic to talk about because it's kind of only discussed with any seriousness for action at the real fringe ends of politics. And I consider myself to be pretty non-aligned. I'm not interested in the standard ideologies, at least. And so it's funny to me that this one is kind of like a horseshoe thing, where at the far right, you've got sort of sovereign citizens types being concerned with this. And at the far left, you've got, your sort of green/communists being really concerned about corporate control and things like that. But for some reason, these issues don't really seem to cut across the center, even though they are often really big ones that concern all of us. And I think that's probably a sign of party capture and sort of complicity, because obviously if you're in on the racket or you're benefiting from it in any way, you don't want to change it. And so many of these situations are exactly that. It's a very clear trail of being on the teat. But I think it's high time that these issues left the fringe and became sort of pan-Australian issues, because they represent a huge opportunity for what we could be doing to radically improve Australian society in the favour of the people who live there. And that seems worth doing to me. And as I said earlier, these are issues that are not just faced by Australia. Many of them are universal, kind of across the planet almost these days. But there is a certain Australian flavour to many of them, and the confluence of Australia's history as a literally colonised place gives it a particular flavour that I think is worth addressing in a distinct Australian way. And of course, maybe a consequence of everything that I've talked about so far is that we have a kind of cultural colonialism or cultural colonial mindset. I guess it's both supply and demand driving it, but we consume far more American content than our own. And this doesn't just go for movies and fictional series and music and things like that, but that feeds into our political discourse as well, where the ideas that we have around what are the fault lines of our society tend to come from America rather than our own real problems, which, as I've talked about on the podcast before, are distinct and warrant their own attention. And without being talked about in the terms in which they exist, are kind of impossible to solve. And to mention the one that I talked about earlier, Indigenous disadvantage, this is a real big one. And it was really striking during the COVID lockdowns how we had our own Black Lives Matter protests as an echo to the US ones, even though it was phrased in those terms, Black Lives Matter, when there's any number of incidents in any given year that would deservedly prompt organised protest movement against the conditions in which Indigenous people live in Australia. The fact that we were only able to rally that attention and channel it because there was a parallel racial movement at the time in the US, it just is a good indication of the cost of having a sort of skewed cultural identity and that inherited mindset where we don't generate our own ideas at the same rate as which we accept them from the outside. But I think all these topics probably warrant their own podcast episode each. It would be very easy just to talk about Australia's poor gas deals or mining deals or the back and forth corruption of politicians to board directorates. Each of those would happily sit within an hour of deconstruction. So I'm really just cursory glancing across the top of things today. But as fun as it is for me just to throw out problems and to say, oh, this is why this sucks, this is why this is stupid, this is why this is wrong or whatever, I don't just do these topics or this podcast as just a fun recreational thing. I think there's great utility in understanding things as they are, because if you don't know the truth of things, you can't respond to them correctly. And in the case of Australia being a colony, well, in many cases, it might not necessarily matter. It's more a curiosity. But in some important cases, like how we choose to go to war, or how much are we a democratic state, or how much do we have control over the resources that we ostensibly own, I think that it is really important. And it's useful to understand in these terms because I think it provides a neater path to understanding what the remedies might be or what useful paths of action might be to take to address these problems where you have them. Because one of the great Australian traits of our colonial culture, which is maybe the worst one, is our instinct to assume that the answers should come from above. That's not literally King Charles will come in and fix our problems, but I do think more than other societies that I've lived in, by quite a way, Australians feel that the government should solve whatever problems there are in front of us. And if you have an understanding that the government is soft or hard or unconsciously complicit in a kind of corruption where there's never going to be movement on things like our resource ownership or how we regulate corporations or whatever, then it guides you to understand that there are probably other forces to pursue, other modes of action to pursue. Because I've seen, in the case of environmental interests where they conflict with corporate ones, I've seen people spend their whole careers of decades only campaigning government and only hoping that government will change these things, when the evidence is pretty clear now that that's not going to be the sole path by which change is going to occur. And when you hope for government to fix things, it often leads, unfortunately, to a blind spot where you disempower yourself and abdicate whatever responsibility you might have for smaller changes or for other methods of change or whatever it may be. So hopefully this tour of what my impression of Australia's outsourced sovereignty has been useful to you. Please arc up in the comments, because there's a million topics that I would have missed and a million ones that I've done an injustice to by just skirting over. So join us, as I said, over on Instagram, Chris Andrew Podcast, and let me know what you think. And of course, just write to me directly at any time. Always happy to hear what you think. But I'm even more happy to hear what you think if you're one of my paid supporters over at patreon.com/Andrew. So thanks again to my patrons for picking today's topic. And next week I'll be doing another patron topic. So stay tuned. And yeah, take care of each other out there. If you listen to the end and you're not an Australian, thank you so much. I hope that any of it made sense. For those of you who are Australians, g'day. And to the collective of all of you, thanks so much for listening. I look forward to chatting again next week. Take care.